Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending where in the world you are. I'm Lisa Berkeley, and this is today's reaction to response webinar. And today's guest with us is Dr. Robert Zuber, and he is with us from New York and from the UN. And before we get into a conversation, let me just go over a couple of things about housekeeping. First, reaction to response was birthed through the Charter for Compassion's Women and Girls sector. And the Charter for Compassion, we're in over 400 cities with 1,800 partners in 53 countries, and we're divided into 12 sectors. You can learn more about us at thecharterforcompassion.org. Also, after today's call, or webinar, I should say, we're going to have the reaction to response after party. And you can, for those of us who are on the webinar right now, if you look in the chat section, the information for either signing in through video or calling in is in the chat section. Or if you look on the screen right now, you may want to get a pen and jot down the information. We will be sharing this with you later on in the webinar as well, the information. So last couple of things, the call is being recorded. And if you have any tech issues, you can go to zoom.us. And if you have any questions or comments during the call, you can type it in the chat section or the Q&A section, which you can find if you hover at the bottom of your screen. As an aside on that, Dr. Zuber, or Bob, is working at the UN, and as we spoke about in advance, uses some terms that are very specific to the international United Nations language. So if you hear terms that you're not familiar with, feel free to go ahead and ask in the chat section. Lastly, I just want to say thank you for the folks behind the scene: Sandy Harp, Brianna Thorpe, Susan DeGaia, and Betsy Spano. Okay, so let's get into our conversation. And as you all know, one of the goals of the women and girls sector is to support the UN sustainability goals. But before we get into that, we're going to have another little bit of a conversation with Bob. So I'm going to put a stop share. And Bob, have you give us a little bit of information about your connection to the United Nations and just a little bit of context. And on the screen right now is actually should be you, and I will switch back to the overview of the UN so people can just get a quick glimpse, and then we'll dive into a much more juicy conversation. This is a little bit more of the drier, more boring part, we could say. So, Bob, good morning. And
good morning, Lisa. Thanks for having me. Thanks for everyone participating and watching and chatting. It's a pleasure to be here. And Charter for Compassion is just one of the greater names for an organization that I've heard in quite some time. I love that. It has all kinds of possibilities, and they're all good. So thank you for that as well. Lisa asked me to say a little bit about the UN, and I will, but probably more in context than, sort of running through the principal organs and and all the rest of it. It's on the screen. It's not that interesting. The fact that these organs exist doesn't mean that they necessarily always do their jobs or do the jobs that we need them to do in the way that we need them to do them. So I want to begin with a story that illustrates a bit about the UN's capacity and some of its limitations. I have a very active Twitter feed. It's not under my own name; it's under the organization's name. But it's about 4,000 policy people and diplomats, and we have a good back and forth with them about all kinds of policy issues. I got an image yesterday. Maybe some of you saw it on Twitter. It was a Rohingya boy along the Bangladesh-Myanmar border who had been tortured by Myanmar military people, and he was standing quite defiantly. I think maybe he was 8 years old, maybe he was 9 years old. His face was a mess. It was all bloodied. I mean, obviously he'd been beaten pretty severely. and the other children were sort of standing around him, not knowing how to react, not sure if they should interact. And I was really moved by that picture for a number of reasons. One of which is, I've seen many instances like that in Harlem during the crack cocaine time when I was a pastor, in the south of the Philippines where I lived for a while, in Bosnia, in Central Africa where I go fairly regularly. There's the ability of people to conjure up ways to make each other's life miserable is sometimes really discouraging. And the other reason why it moved me is because I work in an institution that, in this particular instance, as in many other instances, has really been slow on the uptake. The UN's response to Myanmar, it's been in the news. There's been outrage from many civil society groups. There's been special outrage from women's and children's groups for good reason. That the UN bodies tasked with responding to Myanmar, especially the Security Council, have basically dropped the ball, as they drop the ball often on violence of this sort. They get to it. In fact, the Security Council this afternoon, under any other business, is going to finally take up the Myanmar situation. But take it up in what sense? And take it up to what end? With what capacity? Within what policy framework are they going to take this up? I don't know, because I'm not going to be there, and I usually am there. But the fact that it has taken this long, the fact that children of all people are being tortured along a border for reasons that I'm not clear about at all, is really discouraging. But our response to that, I think, is even more discouraging, and specifically the timing of that response. And that is the one of the sadnesses of the UN for me. There are many things about the UN that are not sad, but one of the sadnesses for me is the fact that we tend to be almost exclusively in reactive mode. There are very few people that are sitting in rooms thinking about what the future is going to look like and what children have a right to in this world, and what we have stripped from that expectation by our own failures of response, our own inability to get after things in the manner in which we need to. We don't have people to do that, and so we're always getting caught, metaphorically speaking, with our pants down, because we're not out in front of the things that we need to be out in front of, and we have plenty of experience to know how to do that. And so there's only two explanations for why it is that we can constantly keep repeating that pattern of not getting out in front of things. And I think the first one has to do with the fundamentally political nature of the United Nations system, and the Security Council being the most political space in a political space. That things have to get worked out among 194 member states, many of whom don't see the world in the same way. And there's always this need to strive for consensus, which is a good idea, but it's a slow idea. And so the politics of the place make getting out in front of things highly problematic, for reasons that I can go into more in depth. I think it's probably not important. But the other thing about it, which is apropos to this podcast, I hope, and that we can talk about a little bit, is that is the good policy requires better people. It requires things of us. It's not just about our institutions. It's also about us. It's about us as implementers of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's about us as promise keepers. When we set a policy in motion, that we have some obligation to keep it, because we've established expectations through our promises. That's what promises do. They allow people to navigate the world, knowing that there's some things that they're going to be able to rely on. That's what that's about. And when we break promises, you know, in your personal lives what that sounds like and looks like. It shakes us. It shakes our worldview. It shakes our sense of certainty or stability, that we need to go out and do hard things in the world, whatever those hard things are, raising children, even falling in love, for God's sakes. You know, there's just a lot of those things that require a certain amount of emotional stability, and that requires institutions and people who are committed to fulfilling their promises. And so it's partially about that, but it's also about looking at ourselves, which the UN doesn't do very well. You don't hear people apologizing at the UN. The UN doesn't have a lot of softeners in its language. It's a hard-edged language for the most part, not very personal. But that we have a responsibility, to work on ourselves in the same way that we work in the world. Mm-hmm. And to make sure that there is some basic confluence of energy between ourselves and the people we're evolving into and the world that we want to impact as it evolves. Mm-hmm. And this is, I think, really significant. And I will say one more thing about this Rohingya boy, which was, I wish I could share the image because it's really, it's very, it's a wonderful image of a 8-9-year-old boy, his face covered in blood with this kind of defiant look. And it's hard to know to what extent that look, I mean, we all have camera face, right? I mean, anyone who's seen people take a selfie knows that 2 seconds after the selfie's done, there's often a very different visage that people are wearing. I mean, we all sort of ham for the camera. We all have our little camera face. I assume this boy has one as well. But to the extent to which he is actually defiant in the face of what actually happened to him, I just, we need to find that kid and bottle him. It's really quite remarkable. And you see this all the time. You see it from people with high visibility like Malala. You see it with people without visibility at all. There's character under every bush, under every leaf, in every household, and we need to mine more of that and put more of that into policy. So that's my opening statement. Oh, and I have to talk about this. Sorry, the Sustainable Development Goals. All right. Well, really, really quickly.
I'm gonna.
Go ahead.
So you're good. I mean, you've just given so much meat to work with, and actually in a point to the sustainability goals, which I'm going to put up on the screen right now. You mentioned that people are so busy being reactive, and that's obviously the theme of all of our reaction to response webinars is how do we shift from fear-based reactions to care-based and dignity-based and compassionate-based responses. And you've really touched on a lot of that question about the role that people need to really, especially in leadership positions, reflect internally and be self-aware a little bit. And so if we look at the sustainability goals through the lens of where are we reacting versus where are we responding, what do you see? I mean, are these really sustainable? And what are your thoughts on the sustainability goals?
Yeah, I think that that the UN in general, there really isn't any malevolence around this. I think it's just sloppiness, and we try to remind them of this on a regular basis, and they don't always appreciate it. But these 17 goals and 168 targets, this represents the single most important promise that the UN has ever made to its constituents. Mm-hmm. And given our history of not honoring lesser promises, I think that with all the good work that's gone on in the last year and a half around making the resources available, the money, the data, the implementing agencies at national level, getting all those resources in line so that we can really take a shot at this. This is an extraordinary endeavor, and there are again, because there are no, first of all, this is not a treaty. There's no punishment for governments that don't meet their targets. And as as I was just mentioning a minute ago, there's nothing about us that needs to change ostensibly, and that we're not in a position where things are required of us in addition to things being required of states and international institutions, which I think is a big mistake. If the development goals have any chance at all, it's going to be through local implementation. It's going to be communities coming together, believing that these goals are indispensable to the survival of the planet, let alone the survival of their families. And that if they, and that it's the local level at which these goals and targets are going to have to be worked out. The more macro the agenda, the less likely the promises are to be kept. The more multi-level, multi-dimensional the response is, the more likely those goals and targets are to be implemented, at least in part, if not in whole. And if you look through the targets, if you look through the goals again, you recognize that some of them represent like truly existential crises. The state of our oceans is it's appalling, and our unwillingness to understand our dependence on oceans and our relationship to them. Climate action, goal 13. We are. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, but as a U.S. citizen and having recently read some of President Trump's executive orders around making America great again in the energy industry, and when you read the implications for the climate, aside from the fact that they're a climate denier, makes that just kind of a joke. Sorry.
Well, I mean, no, I think, and I don't think the U.S. is indispensable to the fulfillment of the climate goal, but I also don't think that the climate goal is likely to be fulfilled. I mean, I've spoken to many scientists around the UN, and I have not met one of them that is optimistic that we can sustain a 1.5 degree centigrade rise in global temperatures. And the implications of not doing that, I think, are not only for polar bears and for coastal areas, but for the climate as a whole. It's very, very serious.
So
go ahead.
No, well, I didn't mean to cut you off. Do you want to?
No, that's fine.
Okay. So, last month we had a couple of people on who were talking about shifting our economic paradigm. And pretty much they both spoke about how, a lot of the way that we're building the world is based on a present day economic understanding, which really is not sustainable, especially when we see people developing more into shared economies, etc. And that it really diminishes the capacity, certainly on a global level, to achieve these goals. But I think your point, and I'm going to stop sharing here and bring it back to you. I think you're about bringing us to the community level, and then to possibly to the individual level, is not only more empowering to people, because when you look at the state of the world and you read the newspapers and you see this, for example, this boy whose face, beaten in blood and defiant, that just breaks your heart. And for me anyway, thank God my heart is still feeling, and it just brings tears to my eyes. And I think that when least certainly with this community, it's people who want to make a difference. And when you bring in these, how do we do this at our local level? Then it's like, oh, okay, I can do something. I can engage. And then we have to start having a very different conversation. So I really appreciate that kind of feedback here.
Yeah, and if you look at, thanks, Lisa, and if you look at the goals again, if you could put those up, one of the interesting things is that, you know, when people look at these goals outside of UN context, I mean, very few people quibble with the goals themselves. I mean, we do need inequality. Economic inequalities are rampant. Infrastructure is crumbling. We've got to find hundreds of millions of jobs for this younger generation, which is the largest generation in human history. We haven't done enough on clean energy. Gender equality is still an aspiration, unfortunately, not a fact. We're still trying to figure out how to move food from the places where it's grown to places where it used to be grown and can't be grown any longer. The need for trustworthy governance is critical, because there are more and more people in more and more places that don't trust their own leadership. And you know, our oceans there's more plastic than fish in the oceans almost. So every one of these has
is that a fact? Sorry. Was that a fact, or was that a mild snarky comment about?
No, it's not a snarky comment. The prediction is that within 10 years there will be more plastic than fish in the oceans at current rates. So and you know, the point is, you know, the point is, one is that we've made a mess. Two, that we have to own the mess. But three, when people look at these goals, one of the things that, you know, it's like, oh, this is great. I'm glad, quote, somebody is doing something about this. But the question of, well, where's my own entry point? You know, what are the things within the spheres of my own influence and the spheres of my community's influence? What's our role in that? What's our role in any of this? And when the UN talks about, well, we need partnerships to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals, yeah, we do. But when the UN talks about partnerships, what they're talking about is like Google and the World Bank. They're not talking about you. And so where is the you in this? And you know, what are the capacities that exist in our spheres to make the change that we are capable of making, and to link to other people making other kinds of change that we also need to have made. This seems to me to be the critical matter, and that's part of the reason, you know, why we spend so much time sitting in UN conference rooms, you know, patting them on the back, but also critiquing their policy work. But it's also why we affiliate, and why it's so important to affiliate with the women in international securities of the world, and our own, you know, our Green Map project, run by Wendy Brower, that takes some of these goals and opportunities and puts them on maps so that people can see what needs to change, and also who's making change in the communities of which they're a part, and sort of bring the agency of change to a level that's very, very different from this kind of macro, you know, we have the right images and we've got the right goals and we've got everything lined up, except the hands and hearts that are going to be able to make this change in the time frame that we need to have it made. And that's a very different thing.
Indeed. So in a comment that I was in a separate little bit of chat, Sandy Hart, who is the director of the Charter for Compassion Women and Girls, said, you know, we really need to have an 18th goal, sustainability goal, which is on self-awareness and personal agency. And I think that that's a really, really excellent point.
Yeah, it's a great point. Well done. Yeah, we do need it. And this is the limitation of having goals developed at the center of global governance rather than, at the center of community life. They just, I think that most of these goals are, if we could do due diligence around those goals, the world that babies being born today would grow up as teenagers in would be a much safer, healthier world than the one that we have. But there are limitations in the goals, and I think she's hit one of the main ones, which is that we're that there's not a self-awareness, there's not a self-growth and change goal, right? There's not this sort of if good policy requires better people, there's no better people goal in this thing, right? There's nothing that's required of us apparently to change in order to affect this, when we know there's lots that we need to change. I need to change. So, but I think there's other things that are not in the goals as well. For instance, there's because governments were largely responsible for endorsing these goals. We had input, other groups had input, lots of it, more than we did. But the governments had to endorse these goals at the end of the day. And one of the products of that endorsement is that there's very little in this framework about weapons. And so so it's like one of the existential crises is related to the not only the proliferation of weapons, but the massive production of them, and the upgrade, the upgrading of weapons, the modernization of weapons, and for every weapon that's modernized, one that's a little bit less modernized, still lethal, ends up somehow finding its way into an illicit market that then finds its way into the hands of traffickers and moves from one place to another. We just have so many weapons in so many different places, and there's very little about there's something about, there's the peace is a part of goal 16, but it's mushy, and it doesn't deal much with hard security. And one of the hard security issues obviously has to do with the massive production of weapons that still goes on in the world, and for which we are not taking responsibility. Yemen is, the carnage in Yemen, the humanitarian crisis, the cholera was set in motion in part by large-scale weapons sales from the UK and the United States to Saudi Arabia, with full knowledge of what it is that we were going to do with them, what Saudi Arabia was going to do with them. And the United Kingdom was the sponsoring country for the arms trade treaty, which we worked on and then broke from. But the UK is now selling arms to anything that moves at this point, and this is what we feared in that having a weak treaty makes for lots of when it suits government purposes to sell weapons to whomever they want, and to create rationales whereby those weapon sales are legitimate when they clearly aren't.
So I have a question for a second, because you actually just kind of blew my mind a little bit, and I've just now, I've put the goals back up and I'm re-looking at them. And actually, to your point, they're incredibly beautiful and lofty goals, but it's not talking about any of the isms, whether it's terrorism or racism or feminism or genderism, any ism, like any real world, practical, pragmatic problem is not actually being spoken about here. So this is going to reflect my ignorance, and so I take full responsibility for that. But I wonder how much, so these are what the overarching goals, these are almost more like the outline. How much of what is there substantiating documentation or ideas or intentions behind these that say, well, in gender equality, we're looking to mitigate sex trafficking or of people or something like that. I mean, are
Yeah.
there broken
Yeah.
down?
The gender goal, I think, actually is one of the better ones in terms of its metric.
Right. Okay. So, got it.
So, and thank God for that. And there were people who were pushing very hard on all of these goals, but I think the ones that got the most attention in the short term, they all got attention, but I think the ones that got the most attention in the short term were the poverty goal number 1, the gender equality goal number 5, the ocean goal number 14, and maybe, no, probably not, and maybe the hunger goal 2.
Mhm.
But 1, 5, and 14 got a lot of attention for a variety of reasons. One of which is that the president of the General Assembly for last year, Peter Thompson, pushed really hard on those. And another one is that for many, these goals were not presumed to be prioritized, right? In other words, number 1 isn't necessarily the most important goal. But for a lot of the smaller countries, number 1 is the most important goal. So there was, the conversation in the UN was poverty reduction is the most important thing we need to be doing. And for many of the countries that advocate for that, we need capacity support from the outside in order to make that possible.
So,
I'm sorry, do you want me to say something about the gender goal or?
no,
Okay, no, I'm sorry.
unless there's something burning that you feel you'd like to say, because I'm just looking at our time, and we have about 20 or so more minutes, 25
Okay.
minutes. So, and
just one more thing about the gender goal, if I could.
Yeah, of course.
One of the things that concerns me about the UN at this point is that it is that well, not always a bad thing, but the rhetoric around the UN is heavily about gender equality, although there's not necessarily a lot of movement in that direction, but there's a lot of rhetoric around gender equality. There's also a lot of rhetoric around youth, which nowadays seems to imply anyone who doesn't have an AARP card, right? I mean, the whole notion of youth has just gotten stretched almost to absurd dimensions. So like, I'm not a youth anymore because I'm over 60, but other people are a youth apparently, and good for them. Well done. But one of the things that I think it's an important metaphor for all of us, because we live in societies where we're being pushed to look ahead, is that we also occasionally need to look behind. We need to look behind as in who we've left behind, but we also need to look behind in the sense that the youth that are now at the UN clamoring for youth participation tend to assume that they are the sort of like the last generation, right? They're the last generation that we need to be paying attention to. And I keep saying to them, yeah, it's okay. And this is from me, who is out of the house for good at 16, right? I'm not really into this kind of youth at 35 thing, but that part of what they need to be looking at now are the generation of children behind them. Because, there are 4th grade girls, who are looking at this world and, going, does life have a chance, right? I mean, is there any point to this? And they may not articulate it that clearly, but I think we do have a responsibility to constantly keep looking behind ourselves and saying, what's next? Who's coming next? And what do they need? And what, the framework that worked for 30-year-olds is not going to work for 6-year-olds. And what does their trajectory look like? Well, and I think the gender goal allows for more of that than most of the other goals, and that's one of the reasons why I like it.
That's actually really interesting, because one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking and in advance of this call too, is how the gender equality goal is a really, really interesting goal, because in developing nations, and certainly in huge portions of the world, girls are third-class citizens behind the cows and the chickens that you can actually eat or barter with. Although girls get bartered too in some of these countries, so that's a whole other topic.
They do indeed.
Right, but this interesting place of in the developing world, girls are second-class citizens, and yet, and also to your point about youth, in first, we're not using first world, advanced developed countries, I guess we could say, the US, Europe, etc. The gap now is that the boys are being left behind and the men are being left behind. And I think it's this millennial generation that the women, for the first time, will be earning more and first home buyers than the men. And then you shared earlier today, which maybe you can share with us, a bit of a study that was done in New York trying to prove that girls needed more attention. And I find this really interesting because we're so busy focusing on gender and we're still working in this weird binary definition of gender. Not weird, but traditional binary definition of gender.
Right.
And so we're in this shift. How do we identify gender? And how does that impact how we view the world? And then a lot of things that we've talked about in the reaction to response webinars is it's not about gender, it's about masculine energy and feminine energy, of which we all integrate internally. And if we can start focusing more internally on the dual natures, which we both have, some more of one, some more of other, then it starts to be a very different conversation. And it's just sort of an aside point that comes to mind about how do we bridge this? Because we're not actually doing it just by focusing on girls. That's not going to fix the bigger issue problem.
No, and well, it probably isn't. And I think you've raised a really, really interesting point. And I'll just share that story quickly and then make a reflection. Is that okay?
Yeah,
if I share this story?
Yeah, you're good.
So I have a friend, a close friend, who's I've known forever, and she is now no, she's not now. She was the deputy director of the Department of Health in New York City. And she was asked by the mayor's office to conduct, she's a very good researcher, and as is her husband, they're really terrific. And she was asked by the mayor to conduct a study of educational outcomes and needs of children in the New York City school system. It was a fairly broad topic, but there are metrics that you can apply, and she's good at that, and she did. And they were quite convinced that what the study would show is that there are still discriminatory gaps in girls' access to education and the degree to which they're taken seriously by their teachers and by the system as a whole. And what the study revealed quite conclusively is that the problem in the school system now is not with girls, it's with boys. It's the boys that aren't getting attention. It's the boys that aren't getting what they need from teachers. Many boys are getting exactly what they need from teachers. So I'm not making it sound like this is not essentialism, but that if there was a gap that needed to be addressed, it was a boys' gap, not a girls' gap. Mm-hmm. She was subsequently fired within a short period of time because she didn't produce the data that they had already decided in advance needed to be produced. This is a common problem, and it's a story, I think, that is a cautionary tale for the Sustainable Development Goals, because data is so problematic. The end result of data is not terribly problematic all the time, but the sort of, what are you measuring, and what did you expect to be able to measure, and what are your expectations for results, and how do those results get manipulated by states, and who gets to collect the data, and how is that data parceled out? I mean, Zimbabwe is not in a position to do a lot of data analysis, so they're going to be getting it from somewhere. Where are they getting it from, and what do they do with it? But also, how has it been filtered by people not themselves, right? So there are all these issues around data, and 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 ways in which we can manipulate it. And I think the Sustainable Development Goals are, I think it's really problematic. But I think the other thing that's problematic, and there's something that it's not an accusation, but I think it's something that we need to look at, which is all of us, me too, which is the degree to which we end up defending a consensus that no longer exists. Because one of the things about the UN is that once you set up a structure, the structure then takes on a life of its own. I'm fine with UN Women, but UN Women is a people spend a lot of time defending UN Women as a structure, which is different than defending women's rights and issues. They're not the same.
What do you mean by UN Women?
Well, the UN Women is an agency within the UN. It's one of the structural agencies of the UN. And I think that there comes a time for all of us when we have to be really careful about defending things because it suits our political agenda or our need for status or whatever it is. Once the horse has left the barn, we've got to follow the horse, and there's not a lot of it's very difficult at the UN, even with a reform-minded team like we have now, to get people to give up things once they have established them, even reorganize them in a way that they need to be reorganized, because people have vested interests, and those vested interests, all of our vested interests, get in the way of justice at some point, at some level, and we have to be mindful of that, I think. Mm-hmm. One thing I would like to comment on about gender at the UN, if you don't mind, just really, really quickly.
You're fine.
I think there are 4 key positions, leadership positions in the UN. President of the General Assembly, President of ECOSOC, the Deputy Secretary General, and the Secretary General. I think this is the first time in my tenure at the UN, which has been a fairly sizable one, when the 4 leadership positions were gender balanced. Amina Mohammed, who's the Deputy Secretary General, has just been a rock star at the UN. I mean, I can't tell you how. I mean, she was there before to help develop the Sustainable Development Goals, the working group. But she's just been a rock star, and it's fantastic. The president of ECOSOC is also a woman now from Hungary, I believe. And maybe it's not. Maybe it's Romania. Maybe Romania. Anyway, I'm sorry. I should know this, but I don't. Yeah. But the fact that we have gender balanced leadership is not good enough, but it's certainly moving in the right direction, which we're all happy about.
I'm going to just interrupt you for one thing, just so
Sure.
People hear on terms. Can you state those 4 positions again?
I'm sorry. Yes. So the Secretary General is Antonio Guterres he was the Prime Minister of Portugal, and the head of OCHA, the relief agency.
OCHA.
What is?
I forget what OCHA is.
I forget what OCHA. I'm so bad at acronyms. I always have to look them up.
And
Amina Mohammed is the Deputy Secretary General. She's Nigerian. She was here, as I said, in New York for the open-ended working group process to endorse the Sustainable Development Goals, mm-hmm. and was terrific. And she went back to Nigeria to be Environment Minister, and then was brought back and offered this job, which we were all really happy that she accepted. The President of the General Assembly was Peter Thompson of Fiji, who was fantastic. And as of yesterday, he turned over the gavel to the Slovakian Foreign Minister, who will be the President of the General Assembly for the 72nd session, which started yesterday. And then the Economic and Social Council, which is the sort of monitoring and oversight agency of the UN. It's not full membership, but it's quite It's quite prestigious. It's become much more so in the last 2 or 3 years, and that has a woman head as well.
And that's
And that's
okay.
Economic and Social Council.
Thank you.
The one place where we need where women's voices used to be a few years ago were much more prominent than they are now is in the Security Council. And it's gotten a little better in the last couple of months because governments are bringing more women from capital and letting them take up positions around the Oval, which is good. But there aren't many permanent reps who are women. Nikki Haley is the principal woman around the Oval. She's done much better than I thought she would do. She's not my favorite, but having a woman's voice is a good thing. And we do a lot of Twitter at the UN, and one of the things that I do at every meeting, which annoys the hell out of the diplomats, is that I send out a tweet noting the first time that a woman's voice is heard in a meeting. So sometimes it's early on, in which case I don't bother, but sometimes it's late, and so I'll send a tweet saying, we are now into 1 hour and 7 minutes and in 1 hour and 30-minute meeting, and the first woman's voice is now heard in this chamber. And so we have this sort of chronology of the non-participation of people, and it doesn't make anyone happy except me, but that's fine.
Well, I'm sure it makes a lot of gender advocates happy that you're like, at least there's a voice. And that actually touches on something kind of interesting, which we've also talked about earlier, which is the need for all genders, including white men, to speak up for those who don't necessarily have a voice. And the role of privilege and using privilege in a wise way. But actually, as I'm mentioning that, I'm looking at our time too, and I want to go back to something that we've touched on before, because it's important that people who are watching this, again, start to feel how they can get involved and how they can, how do we face all of these really challenging international issues? And when you and I talked in advance of this call, I asked you, I think I said, what are the challenges you face most as an individual trying to shift a system? And you gave a very good quote from Heschel, which I'm going to ask you to share. And then also spoke about, you made kind of a snarky, but it wasn't really snarky comment, which is the challenges of the UN or the challenges that I face within myself. And that was a very telling, wise statement. Can you speak more about the role of the individual in shifting?
Sure. Well, I think the Heschel quote, it was about the importance of discipline and what Heschel, and if you don't know Abraham Joshua Heschel, you should look him up, because I got to spend a little time with him before he died, and there are some saintly people left in the world, but he certainly was one of them. He was on the right side of a lot of stuff. And was mostly tolerated in the Jewish Theological Seminary rather than revered, but he was really quite something. But the quote basically was, it's about saying we need to be able to say no to ourselves. Mm-hmm. And what he meant, I think what he meant by that, in my experience with him, is the ability to keep our train on the tracks and to not be distracted in the way that we are distracted by material possessions, by status needs, by our vanity, by our smartphones that aren't so smart, by all the things where we voluntarily get off course, rather than stay on course. And this is not. Obviously, we all need a rest, and we all need a milkshake every once in a while, or a beer, or whatever. But it's this isn't about self-denial, but it's about saying no. It's about being able to stop ourselves when we're in danger of either doing something that is going to reverberate or stopping doing something that we know we should do, like not talking ourselves out of things that we should be not talking ourselves out of.
So I found the quote, and it says, "Self-respect is the fruit of discipline. The sense of dignity grows with the ability to say no to oneself." And I think you mentioned that in the context of, paying attention too, and recognizing that we can make a difference, and even when it's hard, that we should continue both reflecting internally and also out externally, um, which was some of the things that you've also talked about of dealing within the UN, of the role of the individual and your own. When we reflect internally, we can shift our own community. I forget the exact quote, but change yourself, you change your village, your family, and you change your village, community, and so on. How much of that is happening, do you think, within the UN context?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think you and I have talked over many years about some of this stuff, and I've always kind of assumed that I and others that do what I do are pretty, we've got a screw loose somewhere, because normal people don't do these things, nor care to, by the way. But there is a responsibility that comes with access, and that is not only a piece of privilege, it's a big chunk of it, right? It's a big chunk of privilege that you get to go places where decisions are being made that affect other people, for good or for ill. Mm-hmm. And we take that very seriously. Now, many of the NGOs respond to this through their brands, right? They have an issue, they become confident around the issue, they push the issue, they get diplomats to embrace their issue. But when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, you realize that expertise is valuable, but that this is a systemic promise. It's not an issue-based promise. Mm-hmm. It's really about what kind of world do we want to live in 2030? What do we owe the people, the children who are coming behind us, and what kind of people do we need to be in order to make that happen? Mm-hmm. And so the tool that we use, rightly or wrongly, is the tool of attentiveness. We're in every room. We're linking issues. We're reminding people that the conversation in conference room 2 is similar to the conversation that's happening in the Security Council, and they need to be having this conversation together. Mm-hmm. That these things are linked. They need to be adjudicated within a common framework, not within differentiated frameworks. Mm-hmm. And the more we talk at the UN about eliminating silos, the more we fortify them. It's an interesting hypocrisy that is grounded in a psychology that we don't examine enough, I think. So, and for me, I don't know. I mean, we've talked about this before. I don't know what else I'd be doing if I wasn't doing this. I'm not that good at very many things. So this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to be shared. We have lots and lots of people who are on the other end of our feeds who ask for advice occasionally, who allow us into their worlds so that we can reflect their worlds, who are grateful for the kind of real-time feedback in terms of what's going on in the UN that they can use in their own planning. But it's a very modest contribution. It's just the one we can make. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's, I think that people have gotten, and we when we travel, we realize this. People have gotten so disconnected, as disconnected from global policy as global policymakers have become disconnected from communities. Right? They just know so little about each other. And so what we need, I think, is more of these kind of brokers of information, the mediators, who can remind policymakers that they're making policy for someone, and that for the most part it's someone they don't know anything about, for the most part actually don't even care about.
Right.
And that the people on the ground, that the point of doing this work is to mobilize and increase participation locally, but it's also to share what you know with people in other places, including policymakers in other places who need to know what you're up to. And so it requires, like working at a personal level and a community level is really important, but it's not for its own sake. It's for the sake of making change in other places. It's the information we move, not the information we hoard, that is the key, I think.
Whoops. Oh, whoops. Sorry, I was muted. Thank you. So I think you pretty much summed it up. I think what we're going to do, because we have about 4 minutes left. So is there anything that is burning in your heart and mind that you feel like you want to share with people? And as we do that, I'm going to just switch again to the information about our after party, where people can actually join us on another platform and interact with you.
Okay. No, that's great. Now let's do that.
It's going to be on the screen. Hold on, we'll switch to that in a second, but I'd like you to maybe finish up here, because not everybody will be able to join us.
No, that's fair.
Okay.
So I guess two things. One of which it has to do, Lisa, with your concern about shifting conversations, and I think it's extremely important. At the UN, you have to make, as you do in personal life with your, with friends and lovers and all the rest of it. We have to make really hard decisions about how much of our conversation is about the received tradition, and how much of it can be innovative or edgy, or changing conversations shifting conversations is difficult work. I mean, we are what we practice, and we practice a certain kind of conversation, that is increasingly kind of edgy and self-protective and acronym driven, and where we want to be heard but aren't necessarily good listeners, and we want respect and dignity from others, but we don't give much respect and dignity ourselves. And so we're all kind of caught up in this framework that is not making too many people happy, actually. But it's a hard habit to change. All habits are, no habit is easy. I do a lot of counseling, and it's some of it is like literally torture, to get ourselves to look at ourselves and to see all of the embeddedness in our lives and the way in which we do things, and map out a strategy for change. It just really isn't easy, and many people don't have the stomach for it. And then the other thing I want to say on the dignity front is that, and I know this is true for me, I don't spend a lot of time in assaulting other people's dignity, I don't think, but I'm certainly in the death by 1,000 cuts club, which is the club whereby you're by your glance, by my glances, by my words, by whatever, that people have to kind of swallow. It's like, okay, that's, I'll get through that. But these tiny subtle ways in which we can kind of undermine people's energy and commitment, and I think that all the things that we do in my field, I think the thing that is the most unforgivable, and there are people in my field who do this, and I hope I haven't done it, but I probably have. The most unforgivable thing is behaving in such a way that people who want to be committed to this work no longer feel that they can be.
That's a big one.
because we simply do not have enough brains and hearts and hands in this work. We are so deficient. And one of the reasons why we're deficient is because are not as attentive as we should be to our gatekeeping and our litmus tests, that we hold out to other people. And it's like, basically, if you don't pass our test, you don't have a role here. Well, no. Our job needs to be to fill the chairs at the table and set up more chairs. It's not about keeping people out. And it is such a sad thing when I see people who just run away from this work, like, screw you all. This is, you're all hypocrites. This is not working, and this is not giving me a sense of hope or possibility. So I'm going to go be an investment banker or whatever it is I'm going to do. We need to keep these people. We need to keep them in house as best we can. Right. That's it. That's all I got.
And to that point, for those of us who are not at that where you are, but want to be or get involved in a small way, that we should keep being persistent, and also have the courage to have our own voices and say, well, what does that acronym mean? Or, hey, wait, I'm trying to help, and have the courage to use our voice. And that goes all the way around. So
yeah, no, it does. And there's, in many ways, and there's also lots of ways we can use our voice to mentor, to reinforce, to compliment, to prod. There's just lots of things we can do with our voices that we don't do enough, I think.
Right on. All right. Well, thank you. So for everyone who is still with us, if you would like to join us, we're going to switch over to our after party. The URL is in the chat section. And we will see you there in a few minutes. And by the way, our next reaction to response call with Sarah Williamson of Protect the People will be September 24th. So we look forward to seeing you all then, and you can register on the Charter for Compassion website, charterforcompassion.org. Okay, everyone, thanks so much, and we'll see you next time. And Bob and everyone else who wants to join us, we'll see you in the after party.
Okay, so what am I doing now? I'm clicking on that other this is too much technology. What am I doing? I'm clicking on the other thing that you gave me?
Yes.
Alrighty then. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you. Sorry I talk so much.
Oh, you're good.